Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner once again, and I'm coming to you today from in front of the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He had a few homes, but this was one of his summer homes, and I just thought it was a good place to come from today. I'm not sure if this is the same home that I told you when we did Hawthorne. Hawthorne eventually moved into one of Emerson's old homes. I'm not sure if this is the same one or not. I probably should find that out. Anyway, Emerson is going to be a real change for us. So we've been reading two of the inventors of the short story. We read Poe, we read Hawthorne, and they both write Gothic tales, darker tales that don't always turn out so well for the protagonists at the end. Today and our next author are going to be two of the transcendentalists, probably the most influential transcendentalists that American lit has known. And Emerson is going to be the first one. Now, transcendentalism is a little bit hard to just explain quickly and simply. Trans means across, right? And so transcendental means that there's some connection, there's some way to move spiritually in the world besides just logically, that there are certain things that go beyond the senses that we normally have. So if you go back, we're going through this unit and there are going to be different literary movements. And we talked at the time of the American Revolution that a lot of the authors of that unit were influenced by the Enlightenment. And one of the ideas was of the Enlightenment was learn the rules of how the world works, learn the ideas of natural law, and you can apply them in a number of fields and make sense out of everything. Now, in Europe, there is a movement called Romanticism. And Romanticism is going to be a pushback against the ideas of the Enlightenment. It's going to say that that may be true, but there's still something extra. There's something else. There is this something beyond what human beings can easily perceive. And one of the underlying kind of like beliefs of transcendentalism is that in nature, some beautiful nature behind the house here, in nature is the answer to a lot of our questions. Because we come from nature. And there's this idea that there's this oversoul, this energy in the world, and that each of us has a little piece of that within us. And the way we can understand ourselves and the world around us is to take that little piece within us and somehow reconnect it with the rest of the oversoul, with the rest of the world. So nature is going to play a really big role for us here. Emerson was, you might argue, he was the father of transcendentalism in America. He published a magazine in which he spread his beliefs and explored them. He was a dinner speaker. He went out many organizations, spoke about the topic, and literally started a transcendentalist movement. Probably his most famous student was his neighbor, Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau's going to be our next author and our next transcendentalist. I like to think of them as this way, that Emerson was the father of the idea, spent a lot of time thinking. He wrote in a journal all the time and then took much of what was in his journal and distilled that down into tightly constructed essays that he then published for the public. So he was a thinker and a writer. And while Henry David Thoreau was also a thinker and a writer, he was also the guy who experimented. He took some of the ideas from Emerson as he saw them, and he literally tried to live them and then write about how the experiments went for him. But we'll get to Thoreau later. We're going to just deal with Emerson right now. So let's get started. We're going to be reading the most famous essay from Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's called Self-Reliance. So the title's pretty self-explanatory, but it means to rely on oneself, not to need society to help you decide. It's going to be a lot about going your own way, doing your own thing, searching your mind, finding the right thing, and doing it regardless of what your friends or others may say you should do. And there's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Our less than essential question for this piece is going to be, how does this essay, and it is an essay, how does it illustrate Emerson's beliefs about this concept of individualism? So if we went back to our very first unit, we talked about those separatist Puritans, the Pilgrims coming over to Massachusetts, and we talked about how the idea of duty to your community was one of the most important things. Emerson is going to say, forget about country. Country's all fine, but you, number one, have a duty to yourself to live the life that's been given to you and to do it in the right way. And so sometimes society will try to steer you in a direction which isn't the best for you. And you need to figure out when. So individualism, guys like Thoreau and Emerson today, they are heroes to those people who want to just be independent. If you're familiar with, there's even a political party called the Libertarian Party, and many libertarians say that their beliefs trace all the way back to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, here's our reader's journal. If you had to think about something for today, the journal prompt says, have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between what you thought was the right course of action and the course that others thought you should take? And then what was your final decision? But let me clear this up a little bit as you think about it. It says what you thought was the right course of action. That's different from what you wanted, right? Sometimes we know that our wants and our desires are different from what we know is best and what is right. So forget about wants and desires here. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about you need to make a decision for what is best for you. And other people are giving you different advice. What do you do? And that's what Emerson's all about. That's what this essay on self-reliance is going to be all about. Now, Emerson, in his essays, he became really famous for writing what we call aphorisms. We talked about aphorisms when we studied Benjamin Franklin. So aphorisms are just going to be very concise, intelligent, or witty sayings, right? Now, sometimes when aphorisms are around for generations and people know them but may not even know where they originated, they become proverbs. All proverbs are aphorisms, but not all aphorisms are proverbs, because I could write an aphorism right now, but it may require for, grandchildren from today's generation to be around before we consider them proverbs. So here's one of the aphorisms, now a proverb, from Emerson. He said, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of our own mind." This idea of individualism, the integrity of what we do. Are there people who have no integrity? Yes. But if you decide to be a person of integrity, the integrity of your own mind is the most sacred thing. There's Emerson again. That's a photograph. We've talked about how we now have photographs, of our authors. Eventually, we'll get to the point where we have color photographs of our authors. All right, some biographical stuff about him. He's born in Boston, Massachusetts. Everybody in this unit, outside of Edgar Allan Poe, is going to be born in Massachusetts. We call it the New England Renaissance, but they're all from Massachusetts. He went to Harvard at age 14. That seems really young. Again, 16 was pretty normal for getting into a university, a college in those days. So he is ahead, but it's not like he's there, studying with 18-year-olds or something like that. Briefly, after he studied to become a minister, a clergyman, he worked as a clergyman. But once he started experimenting with his ideas on individualism and his beliefs in transcendentalism, he started teaching some things which the church said were outside their doctrine. And ultimately, he was in conflict. And ultimately, he left on his own because he said the only way he could really be the individual he wanted to be and follow the course that he needed to was to leave the church. And then he actually grew as an individual by doing that. He was married first time for only 16 months. His wife died of tuberculosis. Remember the Edgar Allan Poe kind of like focus that we took. Tuberculosis during this time is a bacterial infection of the lungs. We had no cure for it. It was generally a death sentence, and it was highly, highly communicable. So if somebody coughed or sneezed in, or even talked into the atmosphere, other people could breathe that in. Today, antibiotics can cure it. So we have a cure for tuberculosis now. And it's interesting, here where we live in Western Berks, Wernersville in the 1800s was actually a place in America where many people with tuberculosis came, not to die, they came to drink fresh water, stay up on South Mountain, just breathe the fresh air. The belief was if we got you out of the city, you might recover. Many of them who came here to the sanatoriums that we have actually died there on the mountain and are buried even in Berks County. Now, I said a couple times now that Emerson was a transcendentalist. He was the leader. I told you earlier that he founded a magazine to spread his transcendentalist philosophies. That was called the Dial. And transcendentalism has this idea of this connection between the oversoul and this little piece of it that is in every person. And nature is the place you go to do this. I often refer back to Star Wars because Star Wars is very transcendental in its philosophy. If you think of that idea of the Force, and I hope you've seen Star Wars at some point, it's kind of a cultural phenomenon now. But there's a part in episode 4, which was the first one, in which Obi-Wan Kenobi is explaining to Luke Skywalker the Force, and he talks about how it flows around us and through us and binds us all together. That is transcendentalism. That's the kind of stuff that Ralph Waldo Emerson would have taught. But because he was teaching this, that went outside the idea of Christianity, where there is a God and humans are separate from God kind of thing. And ultimately, when he left the church, he said to be a good minister, he had to leave the church. He continued teaching what he believed was a spiritual education. It just wasn't a Judeo-Christian education at that point. He settles in Concord, Massachusetts. That's where this lovely White House is behind me here. It was an artist community. Louisa May Alcott, who was going to eventually then write Little Women, was one of his neighbors. Henry David Thoreau was one of his neighbors. And I believe it might have been, like I said, I'm not sure if Hawthorne lived in the same neighborhood or not. But he remarried a few times. After his first wife died, he married again and had 4 children. He stayed married to his second wife for over 50 years. They celebrated their 50-year anniversary. And he is seen today, Emerson is really important as he's an icon of American optimism. The idea that this is now remember, it's the early 19th century, a young country with unlimited potential. So that's a form of patriotism, even though this is a man who believes in individualism. And he also believed that the sanctity of the human mind and each individual person, we all have one life to lead, and our duty is to lead that in the best way for us. And then independent thinking. He was a big guy about do not follow the crowd. And that's what you're going to see in today's essay. And here's another one of his aphorisms. To be great is to be misunderstood. And in the essay you're about to read, he looks at famous people from history and how, in fact, they were misunderstood by the masses. Some great people in history challenged the way everyone thought, and they were put to death for it. And then years later, we realized they were right. So to be great is to be misunderstood. Self-Reliance first was published in 1841. It was originally ideas that Emerson had collected over time in his personal journal. He pulled those ideas out. He reworked them into a very concise essay. And it is probably the best example of a transcendentalist essay that we have today. People read that. This isn't something you read once. This is something you read again and again and again because you discover something different each time. But even more than that, this is something that you read when you're 16. You read it again when you're 20. You read it again when you're 30. Because as our lives change, the way we see this essay changes. When you're young, you think you see the world as it's going to be. When you get to a certain point, you realize it's not what you expected, but you've learned along the way, and you're a different person than you were. So when you're a different person, you read it and you take something different away from it. Now, the literary tools we're going to look for as we read this one, this is an essay. You've been writing essays, Friday essays for me, all the time. An essay is a brief work of prose nonfiction. Most of the essays you've been writing for me are brief. They're under a page. They're not poetry, but you're still using your most formal language, so that makes them prose. They're nonfiction. They're not about made-up ideas. They're not fantasy. But the key to a really effective essay is a solid single idea. And so as you write your Friday essays, I always say, don't try to respond to the entire source. Find an idea in there that you want to respond to, and then elaborate on that. Go into depth with that. That's what good essays do. All right, and this is going to focus on that one idea, self-reliance. It's in the title what the idea is going to be. The other literary tool that we have is aphorism. Emerson is a master at these little witticisms, these one-sentence pieces of wisdom. And you're going to find a gazillion of them in just 3 pages. All right, so you should stop right now and go read the essay if you're working, virtually, and then come back here and go through these check for understanding questions with me. If you want to do these now, fine. This is an essay. There aren't going to be any spoilers. There's no suspense. There's no surprise ending. So if you want to go with me through the rest of these right now and then go back, that's okay. All right, so number 1, these are some fill-ins. The blank of self-reliance is individualism. Now, the preferred answer for this one is topic. It's in the title, and topics can be expressed usually as a single word or a phrase, not a full sentence. I would also take as a good answer here, the theme is individualism. But I like when themes are expressed more in a sentence form. They're bigger than just a topic. So for example, like a topic could be baseball, one word, baseball. But a theme could be something like baseball used to be America's pastime, but football has overtaken it in popularity, right? That's a theme as opposed to just simply a topic. All right, the essay is a brief work of prose nonfiction. We just did that. The theme in a literary work is the central idea. Theme and topic are very closely related, and you could make a good argument sometimes to substitute one for the other. A strong blank develops a single idea well, and of course, that's going to be an essay again, right? That's the key to a really good essay, is just pick up one idea and turn it all around and look at it from different sides and examine it. And then a short saying of wisdom, a pointed statement, Emerson's a master of them, is going to be the aphorism. So look for those aphorisms. All right, here we have some multiple choices. Now, these are the ideas that are in Self-Reliance. Who have great men always trusted above all else? Well, it's called Self-Reliance, so you can probably figure this out. Yeah, they trust themselves. Above all, trust yourself. How about this one? The ability to follow one's own mind instead of public opinion may serve for what? May serve as the sole distinction between greatness and meanness. Now, meanness in a 19th century sense didn't mean being unkind or cruel. Meanness meant baseness. You're uncultured. You're without good manners. You're without higher order thinking skills. And so the idea that when you can follow your own mind, you might become great. People who just do what they're told all the time are like trained puppies, right? They're very base. They're mean creatures. Not mean being cruel, but mean being low level. Emerson claims that, I love this one, a foolish consistency is what? So this is all about the kind of person who's like, well, we do it this way because we always did it this way. You might remember at some point, I hope you read The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, that famous story in which people, draw slips of paper, and in the end, they pick someone in their community to stone to death. And why do they do it? Because they've always had a human sacrifice this time of year. Some people are like that. They fear change. They want to do things the way they've always done them. And why? Because that's the way we've always done it. So Emerson says that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. I love that word, hobgoblin. But the demon, these foolish consistencies of always doing things the same way, never breaking our routine, to Emerson means you're not a thinker. You're a small-minded person. You're mean. How about this one? Emerson argues that we should speak what we think each day in words as hard as cannonballs, even if it contradicts what we said yesterday. Think how what Emerson is saying here is so different from what so many people believe. Politics or not, if you ever pay attention to politics, one of the things any political candidate party always does against the other party is they look for inconsistencies in their behavior over the years. And they say things like, well, in 1974, you said this. Now you say that. You must be a flip-flopper. Can't you make up your mind? But Emerson would say that we as human beings are on a constant journey to develop our minds and become better and better. And if I believe something in February, but I learned something new in July, and it changes my belief, that's perfect. I should change my belief. And if I spoke, with enthusiasm over how I believed in February and now it's different, I should speak with the same enthusiasm now. We don't want to get stuck into these little ways of these hobgoblins of doing things the same way all the time. All right, so that's all we have for Ralph Waldo Emerson. I think this is one of the finest essays you will ever read. And as I said, you don't read it just once. Read it now, read it again, wait a few years, read it again, wait a few years. This is something you read throughout a life. Emerson was an American philosopher. And I hope you can get something out of it. Keep this in mind too as we move ahead to Henry David Thoreau, because Emerson was the biggest influence on Thoreau. And that's kind of ironic because Thoreau's going to be all about don't listen to your elders. What do they have to tell you? Because they didn't live your life. You need to go live your life. And yet so much of what he learned about that philosophy, he got from one of his elders, his neighbor, Emerson. All right, if you stayed with me to the end, I thank you, and I'll see you in class.